There is a strange kind of silence that hangs over the lake right before a storm. The water goes still, the birds get quiet, and even the wind feels like it is holding its breath. That is exactly what it felt like the morning I realized my handmade mailbox was about to become the center of a battle I never asked for. All over one mismatched box of wood and paint, right before a holiday weekend, I was about to find out how far a certified letter could go. I had moved to this lakefront community for peace. I wanted the sound of water hitting the shore at night, the glow of porch lights reflecting on the surface, and maybe the occasional neighborly wave when I walked the dog. I did not move there to star in my own HOA revenge story. I definitely did not move there expecting a style-obsessed board member to treat my mailbox like it was a crime scene. The first hint came as a feeling more than a fact. I noticed the way cars slowed down in front of my house, how the same white SUV crawled by in the evenings while I sat on my porch steps. The driver's head would tilt just a little, like she was lining something up in her mind. At first I told myself it was nothing. People look. People are curious. That is what I kept repeating while the lake shimmered silver behind her in the setting sun and my dog huffed at the end of his leash. The mailbox itself looked ordinary to me. It was a project I had done over a quiet winter. I used leftover cedar from fixing the back deck, shaped it into a simple house shape with a pitched roof, and painted it a deep blue that reminded me of the water at dusk. I carved my house number into the wood and burned the edges to darken them, then added a small metal loon figure on the top. It felt personal, a little sentimental, and perfectly harmless. It stood on a solid post near my driveway, where the gravel met the road. I did not know that a woman on the board, the one people whispered about as the queen of the design committee, already saw it as a personal insult. I will call her Ms. L. She had straight blonde hair that never seemed to move, sunglasses that matched her SUV, and a talent for making a smile feel like a warning. Looking back, the story started long before the certified letter arrived. It started with a line in our covenants that I had skimmed but never really absorbed, CC&Rs Section 4.3, the mailbox uniformity rule. At the time I had read it, I thought it was just talking about placement and height, not color and style. I figured as long as it worked and wasn't falling over, I would be fine. That tiny misunderstanding would turn into a storm. The board thought they could weaponize one rule and one deadline against me, but they had no idea that the countdown they started would eventually flip their power instead. The morning I realized things were changing, the sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that makes the water look like brushed steel. I walked down the driveway to get my mail and saw an envelope tucked behind the usual flyers. The return address had the association's P.O. box and that familiar logo of a pine tree and a ripple of water. It was just a generic newsletter, I told myself. Just another reminder about lawn height or recycling days. I carried it back to the porch, feeling the paper already cutting into my thumb as if it were sharper than it looked. Inside was a friendly-sounding update from the board. They listed projects, budgets, and a note from the president about maintaining a cohesive aesthetic at our beautiful lakes. On the second page, near the bottom, was an evidence prop I would reread many times, a board agenda excerpt for the next meeting. One line, in tiny print, caught my eye. It said, New business, enforcement actions regarding CC&Rs Section 4.3, mailboxes. I stared at that line for a long minute. The lake was silent behind me, like it was listening. I knew there were a few crooked and rusted boxes up the road. There was the old dented one at the corner house, the fading black one with chipped paint near the cul-de-sac. If the board wanted to tighten things up, they had options. But I felt, in a way I could not fully justify yet, that the white SUV and the line on the agenda were connected. To understand why that single line mattered, you have to understand the community. Our association sat around a long narrow lake, a necklace of homes strung along a looping road. Some houses were modest ranches with faded decks, others were modern builds with big glass windows and expensive boats tied to private docks. The bylaws were thick, but most people treated them like a distant warning, something you kept around but rarely thought about. The board, though, took them seriously, especially the design rules. They had a whole section of the covenants dedicated to visual harmony, community standards, and architectural continuity. I remember laughing at those phrases when I bought the house, imagining they were written by someone who never had to mow their own lawn. The board itself was a tight little circle. There was the president, Mr. K, who loved talking about budgets and liability. There was the treasurer, who always looked nervous when money came up. And there was Ms. L, the vice president and chair of the design committee, whose unofficial job was making sure nothing on our street offended her sense of style. Most people stayed out of their way. We paid our dues, complained in private, and made small jokes about the association at barbecues. Neighbors would describe little incidents in tired, amused voices, someone being told to move their garden gnome off the front lawn, someone else being reminded that Christmas lights had to come down by a certain date. It sounded annoying but manageable. Petty little storms that blew over. Still, there were warning signs. The summer before, a couple down the road had to repaint their front door because the shade of red didn't match the approved color palette. On another street, the board pushed a retiree to remove a small shed he had built near his dock because it hadn't been submitted for formal approval. People grumbled, but they complied. No one wanted to pick a fight with a group that controlled fines, liens, and access to amenities. I met Ms. L for the first time when she walked by while I was staining my porch railing. The sun was glaring off the water, turning it into a sheet of white light. She complimented the view, then looked around as if she was taking inventory. She paused at the mailbox, tilted her head, and narrowed her eyes. She asked, in a soft, syrupy tone, whether I had checked the design guidelines before making it. I told her I had looked them over and figured I was fine since it was sturdy and the right height. She smiled and said she was sure everything would work out. It was the kind of comment that sounded harmless but felt like a veiled note. After that, I saw her more often. Her SUV would move slowly, her gaze would flick between houses, and sometimes she would pull over and tap on her tablet. I caught her once taking a photo in the general direction of my yard, but when she noticed me, she pretended to zoom in on the lake instead. I tried to brush it off, but the pattern kept growing. One week I received a generic reminder about trash cans needing to be pulled back by a certain time. Another week, an email about unified landscaping standards floated into my inbox. Buried in the attachments was a PDF of the covenants, including that same CC&R Section 4.3 mailbox rule. It mentioned approved styles and community standard finishes. It did not mention handmade projects or carved looms. I still told myself it would all be fine. There were too many houses, too many little details. They wouldn't focus on one harmless mailbox when there were sagging posts and crooked doors all over the neighborhood. That is what I believed, standing on my porch in the soft evening air, listening to crickets start their chorus along the shoreline. I was wrong. The board needed an example, and my house, with its visible, eye-catching mailbox on the main loop near the entrance, was perfect. If they could make me fall in line, everyone else would fall in behind me. It wasn't just about wood and paint, it was about power. Eventually, I would call it what it was, the opening stanza in a long piece of homeowners association drama. At the time, though, I still thought I could reason my way through it. I thought this would be a misunderstanding I could fix with a small adjustment or a polite email. I had no idea how quickly it would escalate into something much uglier, over something as small as a box at the end of my driveway. One phrase from that mailbox section stuck with me: non-conforming structures subject to enforcement. It sounded vague, almost theatrical. I did not yet know that enforcement in this neighborhood meant certified letters, daily fines, and public embarrassment tucked into formal-looking documents. The first real shot in this quiet war arrived on a Tuesday in early June. The air was thick and humid, and the lake had that dense, greenish shimmer it gets when summer fully settles in. I walked down the driveway late in the afternoon and saw a stiff white envelope clipped to my mailbox with a tiny binder clip, flapping slightly in the warm breeze. This one did not come through the postal service. The association had hand-delivered it. Their logo sat in the corner like a stamp of judgment. Inside was what they called a courtesy notice, dated June 3rd. It referenced CC&R Section 4.3 by number and said that my mailbox appeared to be out of compliance with approved community standards. The notice explained that all mailboxes in the community were required to match the standard black metal design installed originally by the developer. It stated that non-standard colors, materials, and figures were not allowed. It included a small low-resolution photo of the standard box, as if I had somehow missed the dozens lining the road. At the bottom, it politely requested that I correct the issue within 15 days or contact the design committee to discuss options. It read like a warning delivered with a smile. There were no threats yet. No fines. Just the implication that I had stepped out of line and they were giving me a chance to fix it quietly. I tried to be reasonable. I sat on my porch, feeling the boards warm under my hands, and read the letter again and again. My first instinct was to think it was a mistake. Maybe they didn't realize my box was solid wood, that I kept it painted and maintained. Maybe they were just going down the list of everyone who didn't have the standard black metal. But as the days passed, I noticed something. The rusted, leaning boxes up the road stayed untouched. No notices clipped to them. No envelopes tucked behind their flags. The dented box at the corner, held together with tape and hope, remained exactly as it was. I started counting as I drove, non-standard boxes that looked worse than mine, all with no visible signs of enforcement. It felt targeted. Not imagined, not exaggerated, just obvious. The only mailbox that seemed to matter was the one that dared to be handmade and painted blue on the main loop, the one Ms. L had paused in front of once too often. I tried the polite route. I sent an email to the association's generic address, explaining that the box was sturdy, that the color was tasteful, and that I was willing to compromise. Maybe I could repaint it a dark neutral while keeping the wood. Maybe I could remove the little loon figure from the top. I did not want a fight, I just wanted to keep something I had built with my own hands. Days went by with no response. The only acknowledgement I got was a brief note from the property manager saying that my message had been forwarded to the design committee. That was it. No guidance, no conversation. Just silence and the low sound of motorboats humming in the distance as weekends drew people back to the lake. In the meantime, the white SUV kept circling. Sometimes it would slow down, sometimes it would stop. Once, when I came out to water the potted plants on my porch, I saw the SUV parked across the street. The driver was holding something up, and a faint flash reflected off the glass. A phone camera, a tablet, something collecting evidence. By the time I reached the end of the porch, the car rolled away. Another week passed. The 15-day courtesy period came and went. My mailbox stayed exactly where it was, steady and clean. I watched the days on the calendar slide toward late June, toward the days when the neighborhood would start stringing up flags and hauling out coolers for the big holiday weekend. The board had given me a quiet deadline wrapped in pleasant language, but when that courtesy period ran out and they decided to escalate, they turned a simple mailbox complaint into a countdown that would come back to haunt them before July 1st ever arrived. The next letter did not show up on the box itself. It came with a metallic knock late in the afternoon, when the sky was hazy and the air felt like warm cotton. I opened the front door and saw a man standing there with a clipboard and a small stack of envelopes. He confirmed my name, had me sign for a certified letter, and handed it to me without expression. Then he turned and walked back down the steps, leaving the faint smell of hot pavement and exhaust drifting through the open doorway. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Again, the association's logo sat in the corner, but this time the return address was stamped in bold. Inside was the escalation I had half expected and half hoped would never come, a formal notice of violation, outlining that my mailbox was now an official, non-conforming structure, subject to fines. It referenced the earlier courtesy notice, cited CC&Rs section 4.3 again, and then laid out something new. At the bottom of the page, in language that tried to sound neutral and failed, they wrote that failure to correct the violation by July 1st would result in daily fines of $100. The phrase, $100 per day, stood alone in the middle of a sentence, as if they wanted to make sure my eyes could not miss it. They framed it as a last resort, a step they hoped would not be necessary. I stood in my entryway, the sound of distant jet skis bouncing faintly across the water, and felt a wave of heat wash up my neck. This was not a suggestion anymore. This was financial pressure, a lever they expected me to fear enough that I would fall in line. They were willing to threaten $3,000 a month over a wooden box I had built on my own time. I read the letter again, then again. Each time the words tightened around that date, July 1st. The holiday weekend. The time when families would be gathering on decks, grilling food, and watching fireworks reflected on the lake. While everyone else was enjoying the show, the board expected me to be scrambling to rip out my mailbox or bleed cash. That was the moment the story shifted for me. Up until then, I had just been annoyed, maybe a little hurt. Now, staring at that certified letter, I felt something harden. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about harmony. It was about control, about a handful of people deciding they could bully one homeowner into submission because they happened to sit behind a folding table at monthly meetings. I slid the letter back into its envelope and set it gently on the kitchen table. The late afternoon light came in through the window, casting a wide band of pale gold across the wood and catching on the black print of the association's logo. I listened to the quiet creak of the house as it settled, the soft buzz of a boat far out in the middle of the lake, and I realized something very simple. If they wanted to turn my mailbox into an example, they were about to discover that examples work both ways. Once I admitted this was not about wood and paint, something settled inside me. I stopped pacing circles around the kitchen table and sat down with the certified letter in front of me. The date, the rule number, the phrase $100 per day starting July 1st stared back like they were carved in stone. I realized the board had given me 3 choices: cave, pay, or fight. Only one of those options let me sleep at night. I tried to imagine simply ripping the mailbox out, driving into town, and buying the same standard black metal box everyone else had. I pictured it standing there, bland and anonymous, my carved loon thrown in the trash. The image made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a line in the sand between my home and their control. Paying the fines was worse. The numbers spiraled in my head. $100 a day was $3,000 a month. Stretch that over a summer, and it was more than I had spent building half my porch. It was punishment disguised as policy, a way to make people bend without saying they were being forced. Fighting sounded noble in theory, but what did that even mean against a board that could send certified letters and stack fines? Hiring a lawyer over a mailbox felt ridiculous, even if the stakes were real. My problem was small enough to be embarrassing and big enough to be dangerous if I ignored it. That is the magic trick of a homeowners association when it decides to bear down on you. I sat there with the late afternoon light turning orange through the window and realized I needed to see the people behind this letter in person. I wanted to look at the faces of the board while they talked about enforcement and community standards. I needed to hear how they justified turning something so minor into something so threatening. So I circled the date of the next board meeting on the calendar and decided I would go. The newsletter's agenda excerpt said they would be discussing CC&R Section 4.3 at that meeting. That meant my mailbox was not just a private problem. It was going to be a bullet point, a topic, maybe even a lesson for everyone else. If they wanted to make me an example, I might as well show up and watch how they tried to do it. The meeting was held in the community room at the small lakeside clubhouse. The evening felt heavy, with clouds hanging low over the water and a damp chill in the air that crept in every time the door swung open. The room itself smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning spray, with folding chairs set up in neat rows facing a long plastic table. The board sat behind that table, their name cards propped up like tiny shields. Mr. K, the president, shuffled papers with the self-importance of someone who liked being in charge. The treasurer sat hunched over a laptop, frowning at the screen. Ms. L sat in the center, perfectly straight in her chair, with a neat binder in front of her and a calm expression that felt more like a performance than a mood. A handful of homeowners scattered into seats. Most of them were there for other reasons: questions about dues, complaints about wake from speeding boats, curiosity about planned repairs. I sat in the third row, close enough to watch the board's expressions but far enough back that I could pretend to blend in. The sound of the air conditioner droned softly above us, a low, constant hum. They moved through the agenda with slow, deliberate efficiency. Budget updates. Maintenance schedules. A brief discussion about the condition of the boat ramp. Then they got to design committee report, and the room's energy shifted. People sat up just a little. Ms. L flipped open her binder, and the papers inside made a crisp sound that cut through the hum. She began listing small victories first. Compliance on lawn edging. A reminder about seasonal decorations ending on time. A vague mention of one pending enforcement matter regarding CC&Rs Section 4.3. My hands tightened around the pen I had brought, a nervous habit with nothing to write. Then she reached into the stack beside her and held up a sheet that I recognized even from a distance. It was the certified letter I had received, or at least a copy. I could see the bold print of my lot number at the top. Without saying my name, she described a non-conforming mailbox that had not been brought into compliance after a courtesy notice. She explained, in cool, measured tones, that a formal notice had been issued and that fines would begin if the violation continued past the deadline. She framed it like a simple cause and effect. Violation identified, owner notified, deadline set, fine scheduled. There was no mention of the discretion they had, no sense that they had chosen to make a big deal out of one harmless, well-maintained box. It sounded like a natural force, like rain following clouds. As I listened to her describe a potential $3,000 in fines as if it were just a line item on a spreadsheet, I realized they were counting on that money as much as they were counting on my fear, and that opened a door to a kind of leverage they did not see coming. They moved on quickly, as if my situation was barely worth more than a few sentences. No one in the audience said anything, though I felt a couple of glances in my direction. I could almost sense people calculating silently, wondering if their own little quirks might be next on the list. When the open floor portion of the meeting began, I stood up. My voice did not shake, but it felt tight in my throat. I spoke about my mailbox, explaining that it was sturdy, well-kept, and solid wood. I reminded them that there were far worse boxes in the neighborhood that had never received notices. I pointed out that the rule did not say all mailboxes had to be identical, only that they had to meet placement and safety guidelines, and that their standard box language came from an old, informal policy. Mr. K thanked me for my comments in that polished way people use when they have already decided something. He said the board would take my concerns under advisement. Ms. L added that consistency was important to maintaining property values and that allowances could create confusion. She spoke about precedent and visual continuity, words that sounded neutral but hid a clear message. I walked out of that meeting into the cool night air feeling like I had just watched a play in which my role had already been written. The lake was dark, with only a few scattered porch lights reflecting on the ripples. Crickets droned in the damp grass, and a faint scent of wet earth rose from the shore. I realized then that talking to them in that room would not change anything. They were not interested in fairness, they were interested in control dressed as policy. That realization ended the conflict's first phase. I had tried polite emails, then formal participation. The answer was the same, a polite wall. The fines were coming unless I took out the mailbox or found a different angle. I needed that other angle. The escalation didn't wait long. A few days after the meeting, an email went out to the entire community. The subject line referred to upcoming enforcement actions and reminders regarding mailbox standards. The message reminded everyone of the required uniform black metal mailbox and said the association was beginning firm but fair enforcement to maintain aesthetics. In the middle of the email was a short paragraph about recent non-compliance being addressed. It did not mention me by name, but it did not have to. The timing, the meeting, and the location of my house on the main loop made it obvious who they meant. There was a photo attached of a blue wooden mailbox with a small metal bird figure on top, cropped just enough to avoid showing my porch. The lake shimmered faintly in the blurred background of the picture, a smear of light behind their example of what not to do. Even without names, that email did something deliberate. It made my mailbox a lesson. A cautionary image, a warning wrapped in community branding. When I walked my dog that evening, I could feel it in the way some neighbors looked at the box and quickly looked away. A few gave me sympathetic nods, others avoided eye contact. The air was hot and sticky, and the sky glowed pale pink as the sun sank across the water, but my skin felt cold. A second letter arrived soon after, this time labeled Final Notice, dated June 20th. That phrase sat in bold at the top like a headline. This was another evidence prop I kept, Final Notice dated June 20th, referencing my lot number, CC&Rs Section 4.3, and the earlier certified letter. It repeated the threat of $100 per day fines starting July 1st and added a new line: failure to pay fines could result in further collection actions, including potential liens. They did not spell it out, but everyone in a place like this understands what that means. Now it wasn't just $100 a day hanging over my head, it was the creeping idea that this petty fight over a mailbox could someday show up as a lien on my home, the one thing they assumed I would do anything to protect, and they were about to find out how wrong they were about how that would play out. The association also quietly updated a bulletin board in the clubhouse hallway. On a sheet titled "Current Enforcement Actions," they listed lot numbers and brief descriptions. There, in simple black ink, was my lot number next to the words, "Non-conforming structure, mailbox, fines scheduled." Anyone walking past to check pool hours or clubhouse reservations could see it. It was a small humiliation, but it was designed to work. This is how an HOA nightmare grows. They pinch your pride while tightening their grip on your wallet, counting on embarrassment to keep you compliant and quiet. Social reactions trickled in. One neighbor approached me by the mailbox one evening, looking sheepish, and admitted the email made them nervous about their own front porch chairs. Another told me they thought my box looked nice but they didn't want to be next. Their fear was not loud, but it was present, humming under the surface of casual conversations. That fear told me something important: I was not the only one tired of the board's power games. I was simply the one standing in the spotlight at the moment. So I went back to the document they treated like a weapon, the covenants and bylaws. If they were going to use that stack of paper to threaten me, I wanted to see what else was hiding in there. Late one night, with the steady whisper of waves brushing against the shore just beyond my window, I sat at the kitchen table with the entire binder spread out in front of me. Buried deeper in the bylaws, far from the design guidelines and enforcement sections, I found something that made me sit up straighter. It was a paragraph in a section labeled Meetings of Members. Bylaws Article 7, Section 3 outlined the rules for special meetings. It said that a special meeting of the association could be called upon a written petition signed by owners representing at least 25% of the total votes. The petition could specify the purpose of the meeting, and the board would be required to schedule it. This was the line they did not expect anyone to read, the one tiny door they had not fully locked. If enough of us signed a petition, we could force the association to gather and vote on whatever was listed in that petition's purpose. I printed that page and highlighted the key sentence. I pinned it to the fridge with a magnet, the paper fluttering slightly whenever I opened the door and a cool gust of air brushed past it. That single paragraph changed the shape of my problem. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking only about my mailbox. I was thinking about the board itself, their power, and how it could be checked. From that point on, the escalation felt less like a one-sided attack and more like a race. The board had their fines and their certified letters. I had a petition threshold and a growing list of neighbors who had quietly shared complaints about them. I started making a mental map of the neighborhood. There was the retiree who had been forced to remove his lakeside shed. The couple with the red front door who had been told to repaint it because the shade wasn't approved. The family who received a warning about a small play structure in their backyard. The owner who parked a small camper in their driveway for a few days and received a stern letter. Each of them had been on the receiving end of the same tone, the same polite threats. By late June, a handmade blue mailbox had become the board's favorite example, backed by a courtesy notice, a certified letter, a final notice dated June 20th, and a looming fine of $100 per day starting July 1st. I had tried polite emails and speaking at the meeting, but the more they leaned on that one rule, the more they pushed me toward the small, overlooked bylaw clause that gave owners the power to call a special meeting and challenge them. The days leading up to the July 1st deadline felt weirdly split. On one side, the holiday atmosphere was building. Neighbors were trimming their yards, putting out flags, and stacking bags of charcoal on porches. Kids rode bikes up and down the loop, their laughter echoing faintly against the steady drone of boat motors on the lake. On the other side, inside my house, a quiet pressure grew with every page I reread. The board sent one more reminder email, this one terser. It stated that fines for ongoing violations would begin on schedule and included a note that non-compliant mailboxes would be documented and reported. They added a line that unpaid fines could be pursued using all remedies available under the governing documents. It was the closest they came to saying the word lien in public. Their tone had changed. Less friendly, more clipped. They were done warning, they were ready to collect. I knew that if I did nothing, the charges would start accumulating. Even if I fought them later, I would be starting from a hole instead of level ground. That is when the petition stopped being an interesting idea and became a plan. Section 5 of the bylaws gave me the petition threshold. I just needed signatures. 25% of the owners. It would mean walking the loop, knocking on doors, and asking people to put their names on something that challenged the very people who controlled fines and approvals. It would mean turning private grumbling into open resistance. The board assumed they were the only ones willing to put anything on the line, but as I began mapping out a petition that could cost them their positions and their precious enforcement power, the real money at risk shifted away from my mailbox and onto their seats at that long plastic table. The first step was deciding what exactly to demand. I didn't want the petition to be only about my mailbox. That would be too narrow and easy to dismiss as personal. I wanted it to address the pattern, selective enforcement, petty aesthetic rules, and disproportionate fines. So I drafted the language for the petition in simple, clear terms. It called for a special meeting of the membership to consider 3 items. First, the immediate suspension and review of all fines related to mailbox nonconformity. Second, the revision of CC&R Section 4.3 to allow tasteful, well-maintained custom mailboxes subject to basic size and safety criteria. And third, a vote of confidence on the current design committee leadership, including the option to remove and replace certain members. Reading it back, I could feel the risk. It was blunt but not wild. It used their language, suspension, revision, vote of confidence, and turned it against them. It was not a rant, it was a formal demand that used their own governing structure. I formatted it neatly, added a signature page with spaces for names, lot numbers, and dates, and printed several copies. This stack of paper became another quiet evidence prop, a petition aligned to Bylaws Article 7, Section 3, ready to circulate. Outside, the neighborhood was sliding into the holiday mood. The air in late June had that particular thickness, heavy with the smell of cut grass and grill smoke starting up in the evenings. You could hear distant fireworks being tested across the lake, sharp cracks echoing over the dark water. Porch lights glowed amber against the growing dusk, and music drifted faintly from open windows. Inside, I taped the final notice dated June 20th and the printed bylaw excerpt side by side on the fridge. Under them, I clipped the first petition draft with a magnet shaped like a small house. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I saw both the threat and the answer in one glance. It struck me then how ordinary the tools of this little rebellion were. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches. Just paper, ink, signatures, and a quiet willingness to say enough. It felt small and huge at the same time. I did not rip out the mailbox before July 1st. That date came with a heavy, humid sunrise, the lake's surface glassy and bright. I went out to the end of the driveway that morning and ran my fingers over the smooth wood of the box, over the carved house numbers, over the little loon figure. Somewhere in the association manager's office, they were probably entering a note in a database, fines active as of July 1st. I could almost sense the numbers starting to tick, an invisible meter attached to my address. $100 for today. Another $100 for tomorrow. They thought the pressure would build steadily, pushing me toward surrender. Instead, I let that invisible meter become motivation. Every day they thought they were gaining leverage was another day I spent turning neighbors' quiet frustration into signatures. The same fines they expected would corner me were about to become Exhibit A in a challenge that would drag their decisions into a room full of their own members, where legal consequences would finally be pointed in their direction instead of only at mine. I picked up my clipboard, slid a fresh petition sheet onto it, and stepped out into the warm afternoon. The air buzzed with the sound of cicadas, and distant splashes echoed as people jumped off docks into the lake. Flags fluttered on porches, and coolers sat ready on driveways. It was the perfect cover, everyone was home, everyone was outside, and no one expected something as simple as a clipboard to carry that much weight. The first house I walked to belonged to the retiree who had lost his lakeside shed. The path to his front door was lined with small solar lights that glowed faintly even in daylight. As I walked up, I felt a ripple of nerves in my stomach. This was the moment when my quiet plan became public. If he turned me away, if enough people said they were too scared, the petition would die before it started. I took a breath, feeling the warm boards of his front step under my shoes and hearing a boat motor rumble past on the water beyond the houses. Then I raised my hand and knocked, petition waiting on the clipboard like a question hanging in the heavy summer air. The door opened, and the retiree stood there with that tired look people get when they have already had one too many run-ins with rules that never seem to bend in their favor. I explained the situation, holding up the petition like a fragile bridge between frustration and action. I reminded him of the way they had forced him to tear down the shed by his dock, the way the letter he received had used the same kind of language as mine. His face changed as I talked. At first there was polite patience, then recognition, then something harder. When I pointed out the bylaw clause about special meetings and how many signatures we needed, he nodded slowly. Without much hesitation, he took the pen, signed his name, and wrote his lot number next to it. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than it should have in the quiet of his front entryway. That first signature did something important. It proved the fear of acting was not bigger than the frustration of being pushed around. Walking back down his path, listening to the faint clink of his wind chimes in the warm breeze, I felt the balance shift just a little. The board still had its fines and notices, but I had the first name on a growing list that pointed in the other direction. The next stop was the couple with the red front door that had once been the wrong shade. They had repainted obediently, but the memory had not faded. I reminded them of the paint receipts they had kept, the hours they had spent redoing something that had been harmless. When I explained that the petition was not just about mailboxes but about selective enforcement and the design committee's grip, their skepticism melted into something close to relief. They signed. House by house, I built a quiet circuit. Each conversation followed a similar rhythm. I knocked, explained that my mailbox had become the latest example of non-conforming design, described the certified letter and the final notice dated June 20th, and then shifted to their own experiences. Almost everyone had one: the stern warning about parking, the nitpicking about porch decor, the threat over a minor fence repair. The pattern became clearer with each story. Some people hesitated. They worried about retaliation, about being the next ones on the bulletin board. I understood that hesitation, because I felt it too. But I reminded them gently that their signatures would not be isolated. The petition would reach the threshold or it would not. If it did, it would represent a block of owners speaking at once, using a power the board could not ignore without violating its own bylaws. That was the protection, imperfect but real. One voice could be targeted, a group was harder to punish without consequences. It took less than I thought. Within a few days, my clipboard filled with names and lot numbers. Older residents who rarely attended meetings signed with deliberate strokes. Younger families scribbled their names quickly between corralling kids and tending grills. Some owners asked me to leave a copy they could read in full. When I returned, most of those copies had come back with signatures. By the end of that week, I had more than enough. I counted them out at my kitchen table while the last glow of sunset faded over the water outside, turning the lake into a band of deep violet. 25% was the requirement, but the stack in front of me went noticeably beyond that. The threshold was not just met, it was exceeded. I organized the petition pages in a neat order, clipped them together, and attached a cover letter that cited Bylaws Article 7, Section 3 word for word. I listed the 3 requested agenda items: suspension and review of mailbox-related fines, revision of CC&Rs Section 4.3 to permit tasteful custom mailboxes, and a vote of confidence on the design committee leadership. I also mentioned, without emotion, that the petition represented more than the minimum votes required. Then I assembled what I half-jokingly thought of as my evidence packet. It contained the courtesy notice, the certified letter warning of $100 per day fine starting July 1st, the final notice dated June 20th, and a printed copy of CC&R Section 4.3 with the vague, non-conforming structures language highlighted. I added the bylaw excerpt about special meetings, a copy of the email that had anonymously used my mailbox as an example, and a printout of the bulletin board, current enforcement actions sheet listing my lot number. All of it went into a simple folder, the kind of thing you might use for school papers. As I slid that folder into a large envelope addressed to the association, I realized I was no longer the one facing a potential legal tangle. Once this petition was delivered, the board would be the group forced to answer, in a formal, recorded meeting, why they had turned selective enforcement into a financial weapon against their own members. I did not just drop the envelope in the mail. I had it delivered in a way they understood, certified, with proof of receipt. If they believed in the authority of those green return slips when they sent threats, they could see how it felt when one arrived carrying a demand instead. At the same time, I quietly shared the news with the people who had signed. I let them know that the petition had been submitted and that the bylaws required a special meeting to be set within a reasonable timeframe. I reminded them that attending that meeting was the key. Their signatures opened the door, their presence would decide what happened. The association did not respond immediately. Days passed with no official notice. The fines, at least on paper, continued to accrue. Each morning I looked at the mailbox and pictured some spreadsheet somewhere adding another 100 to a column next to my lot number. Nothing visible in my yard changed, but I could feel the tension thickening like the summer air before a storm. Then, one afternoon, an email finally arrived. The subject line mentioned a special meeting of the membership. The message cited Bylaws Article 7, Section 3 and explained that a valid petition had been received. It stated that a special meeting would be held in mid-July in the same clubhouse room where I had listened to my situation being reduced to a line item. Attached was a notice listing the 3 agenda topics exactly as they had appeared on the petition. There it was. The board had been forced, by its own rules, to bring my fight into a room where they could not control who spoke. The night of the special meeting felt different from the regular one. The parking lot was fuller, with cars squeezed into every space and lining the road. The air was heavy and warm, buzzing with insects and the muffled sounds of music and conversation drifting from houses around the lake. Inside, the community room buzzed with voices in a way I had not heard before. The rows of folding chairs were packed. Neighbors who had never shown up for budget updates were there now, fanning themselves with the printed agenda and leaning over to whisper to each other. The sound of chairs scraping on the floor mixed with the hum of the ceiling fans. At the front, the same long table stood, but the atmosphere behind it had changed. Mr. K's usual confidence looked strained. The treasurer's face had the faint sheen of someone who would rather be anywhere else. Ms. L sat stiff and composed, her binder in front of her, but her eyes flicked across the crowd in quick, sharp movements. The room itself had become a mirror, reflecting their decisions back at them. They opened the meeting formally, reading the purpose of the gathering from the petition. My name was not used, but my mailbox was woven into every line. The first agenda item, discussion and possible action regarding suspension and review of fines related to mailbox nonconformity. The second, proposed revision of CC&Rs Section 4.3. The third, vote of confidence regarding the design committee leadership. I sat near the middle, surrounded by the people who had signed. The evidence packet lay in my lap, edges slightly worn from handling. My heart pounded, but the feeling was less like fear and more like standing at the crest of a hill I had climbed step by step. The board tried to go on the offensive first. Mr. K spoke about the need for standards, property values, and consistent enforcement. He framed the fines as tools of last resort, necessary but regrettable. He hinted that if the association did not enforce its rules, chaos would follow, and everyone's investment would suffer. Then the floor opened to the members. One by one, the stories came out. The retiree described the shed he had been forced to tear down, the cost and waste that came with it. The couple with the repainted door talked about the way they had felt singled out and humiliated. Another neighbor described being warned about a planter that slightly crossed a setback line while other more serious violations went ignored. As they spoke, I could see the board's armor thinning. It wasn't just me anymore, not by a long shot. The pattern I had seen while knocking on doors was now laid out in front of everyone, enforcement that seemed less about clear rules and more about the preferences of a few. When it was my turn, I stood and described my path through the process. I laid out the dates in order, the courtesy notice, the certified letter warning of $100 per day fine starting July 1st, the final notice dated June 20th, the bulletin board listing my lot number, the email that used a photo of my mailbox as a cautionary example. I held up CC&R section 4.3 and pointed out its vague wording. Then I held up the bylaw that had allowed the petition. I spoke calmly, explaining that I had not taken this lightly. I had read the rules carefully, tried the polite path, and only turned to the petition when it became clear that the board's idea of enforcement had crossed into something closer to punishment. I emphasized that my goal was not chaos or an absence of standards, it was fairness, clarity, and limits on the power of any one committee to make life harder than it needed to be. As I finished, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting from me to the board, not with curiosity anymore but with expectation, and I knew that the social shame the board had once tried to pin on my mailbox was now crowding in on them, pressing for a public answer they could not tuck into a newsletter. Ms. L finally responded. She talked about visual cohesion and protecting the brand of the community. She insisted that personal tastes had to be restrained for the common good. But as she spoke, it sounded less convincing than it had in smaller settings. The room was not nodding along. People were crossing their arms, leaning back, sharing quick glances that said more than words. The whole thing felt like a Karen neighbor drama that had finally spilled out of private emails and into the open. When discussion ended, it was time for motions and votes. The association's attorney, seated quietly in the corner, reminded everyone of the process. A member made a motion from the floor to suspend all mailbox-related fines pending review, including those attached to my lot. Another member seconded it. Ballots were passed out and collected. The result was not close. The motion passed with a clear majority. Just like that, the weight of the accumulating $100 per day fines lifted, not because the board had suddenly grown sympathetic, but because the members had drawn a line. The enforcement meter they had started was paused, if not erased. Next came the proposed revision of CC&R section 4.3. A small working draft had circulated before the meeting, prepared by a few of us who wanted to offer a practical solution instead of just anger. The revision allowed custom mailboxes as long as they were well maintained, roughly similar in scale to the originals, and did not include offensive imagery. It preserved standards without demanding uniformity. There was debate, but it was constructive. Some members worried about slippery slopes, others pointed out that tastefulness could be evaluated without insisting on identical black metal. In the end, when it went to a vote, the revision passed. The new language was more flexible, and my blue wooden box with the little loon on top clearly fit within it. That rule, the one they had weaponized, had been reshaped by the very people it was supposed to govern. Finally, they reached the vote of confidence on the design committee leadership. The question was simple: should the current leadership, including Ms. L, remain in place, or should the association move to replace them? The ballots felt heavy in people's hands. This was not an abstract rule, it was about the individuals who had sent letters, made calls, and taken photos. When the votes were tallied, the announcement came with a long pause. The chair of the meeting stated that the members had voted to withdraw confidence from the current design committee leadership and requested the board to appoint a new chair from among volunteers willing to serve under revised guidelines. Ms. L sat still for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she closed her binder slowly. There was no dramatic scene, no outburst. Just a quiet recognition of power slipping away. The aftermath did not feel like fireworks. It felt like a slow exhale after months of holding my breath. The board still existed. The association still had rules. But something fundamental had shifted. Within a few weeks, the board sent out a new email explaining the updated mailbox standard. It referenced the revised CC&R section 4.3, noting that custom boxes were now permitted if they met the basic criteria. It acknowledged, in careful language, that enforcement around mailboxes had raised concerns and that the association was committed to a more transparent approach. A new design committee chair stepped in, a neighbor known for being even-tempered and practical. I watched, with quiet satisfaction, as the committee's tone changed. Instead of stern warnings, people began receiving friendly notes with suggestions and options. The rules were still there, but they felt less like weapons and more like guidelines. My fines, which had technically begun on July 1, were formally waived. The association recorded that all penalties related to my mailbox were nullified in light of the rule revision and the membership vote. The ledger that had once been ticking upward against me was cleared. In a quiet stroke, the numbers vanished. The mailbox itself stayed exactly where it had always been. Its blue paint still caught the late daylight, and the carved loon still perched on top, facing the lake. Over time, it became less of an example and more of a symbol. A few months later, a house further down the loop installed a simple wooden mailbox with a carved fish. Another owner chose a box with subtle stained wood instead of metal. The road did not descend into chaos. Property values did not plummet. The lake kept reflecting the sun exactly as before. As for Ms. L, she stayed on the board for a while but without the same influence. She still attended meetings, but her comments were tempered. She no longer drove slowly past my house the way she used to. If she did, she kept her gaze straight ahead. Eventually, whispers started that she might be thinking of moving closer to family in another town. Whether she did or not, the spell she had cast over design decisions had broken. Looking back, the whole saga feels almost absurd. A piece of cedar and a metal loon, a line in CC&Rs section 4.3, a final notice dated June 20th, a petition threshold buried deep in the bylaws, none of it seems like enough kindling to burn months of energy. And yet, it turned into something bigger than a single mailbox. It turned into a lesson about power and how easily it swells when people stay individually quiet. It also turned into something else, a surprisingly satisfying revenge story, not in the flashy, explosive sense, but in the way small, deliberate steps can bend a rigid system just enough to make it livable again. The board tried to show everyone what happened when a single homeowner pushed against their preferences. In the end, the community saw what happened when enough homeowners pushed back on the board. Now, when I sit on my lakefront porch in the evening, listening to the soft slap of waves against the shore and the murmured conversations drifting across the water, I sometimes glance at the mailbox and remember how close I came to ripping it out just to make the pressure stop. I am glad I didn't. That one choice to hold my ground, paired with the choice to read the bylaws all the way through, changed far more than the color of a box at the end of a driveway. Tell me your HOA horror in one line.